Sign these now while you're still too weak to think straight. The divorce papers landed on Natasha Coleman's hospital bed with a soft thud, ink still wet from the lawyer's pen. Her husband David stood over her, designer suit impeccable, watching her struggle to focus through the post-delivery haze. The twins, barely 3 hours old, slept in the nearby bassinet, oblivious to their father's betrayal. Natasha's hands shook as she tried to lift the documents. The epidural was wearing off, every muscle in her body screaming from 18 hours of labor, but the pain in her chest had nothing to do with childbirth. "You're leaving me now?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. While you're finally where you belong," David interrupted, his tone sharp with years of hidden resentment. "Helpless. Dependent. No more of your little power games." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages with deliberate casualness. "Veronica's waiting for me at the Meridian. We've been planning this for months." His smile was cruel. "She knows how to appreciate a successful man." Natasha closed her eyes, fighting waves of exhaustion and disbelief. Through the fog, one thought cut through everything else: the conference call. During active labor, between contractions that felt like her body was tearing apart, she'd given final approval from her hospital bed. One code, one signature, and her team executed the close. The Pinnacle District acquisition, $2 billion of prime development land, had finally closed. David was still talking, listing his demands for half of everything, when her phone buzzed. A text from her attorney: "Trust activation complete. All assets transferred as requested. Congratulations on both your babies." "I said sign them." David's voice turned aggressive. "Unless you want me to drag this out, make it uglier for everyone." Natasha opened her eyes, studying the man she'd built an empire with, the man she'd trusted with everything. He had no idea that while he was texting his mistress, she'd been restructuring their entire financial world. The irony was so perfect it almost made her laugh. "Where do I sign?" she asked quietly. David's expression shifted to surprise, then satisfaction. He'd expected more fight. "Smart choice. Page 12, page 18 and initial every." "The custody arrangement," Natasha interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "Full custody to me?" "Shared custody. I'm not a monster." David's phone buzzed again. Veronica, probably wondering where he was. "Though honestly, I'll be traveling so much with the new projects, you'll basically be a single mother anyway." "New projects?" Natasha almost smiled. The man was already spending money from companies he no longer owned, planning trips funded by accounts he no longer had control over. The trust structure her lawyers had spent months perfecting was already in motion, and David was completely oblivious. As she signed her name with trembling hands, Natasha realized this wasn't the end David thought it was. It was his beginning, the beginning of the most spectacular downfall she'd ever orchestrated. "Congratulations," she said softly, handing back the papers. "You're free." David took them with a triumphant grin, already heading for the door. "Finally. Enjoy your new life, Natasha. Try not to call when reality hits." The door clicked shut. Natasha's phone buzzed again. Her attorney: "Trust activation complete." She looked at her twins, then at the papers on her bed. And for the first time all day she felt calm. She typed one message to her attorney: "Proceed." Alone with her sleeping children, Natasha allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of tears. Not for David. She'd mourned that marriage months ago when she found his second phone. She cried for the woman she used to be, the one who'd believed love could survive anything. She built Coleman Development before David ever knew what a cap rate was. He sold charm. She built the foundation. The irony wasn't lost on her that he'd chosen to destroy her on the day she closed the biggest deal of her career. Her phone rang. Alyssa Grant, her senior vice president and the only person who knew the full scope of today's plan. "How are you feeling?" Alyssa's voice was careful, professional, even though they'd been best friends since college. "Like I just gave birth and got divorced in the same day," Natasha replied, adjusting her position in the hospital bed. "Status report? Phase 1 complete. The trust is active, all assets transferred. David's administrative access expires at midnight, he just doesn't know it yet." Alyssa paused. "Are you sure about this timing? You could wait, recover first." He didn't wait. Natasha watched her twins sleep, their tiny faces peaceful in a way hers would never be again. Besides, the Pinnacle deal creates a 48-hour window. If we don't move now, he could still file injunctions. What Natasha didn't tell Alyssa was that David's betrayal ran deeper than the affair. 3 weeks ago, she discovered he'd been secretly negotiating to sell Coleman Development to Meridian Corp., the same company where his mistress worked. He planned to cash out their life's work, disappear to Europe with Veronica, and leave Natasha with nothing but legal bills. He'd underestimated one crucial detail. Natasha had built Coleman Development to be bulletproof, even against her own husband. There's something else, Alyssa continued. Legal called. David's already been in touch with his divorce attorney about expediting asset division. He wants everything processed within 30 days. Natasha laughed, a sound with no humor in it. 30 days. He really thinks he's going to walk away with half of my empire. He doesn't know about the loan restructuring from last year, does he? David stopped reading financial documents 2 years ago. He thinks he's a partner. Really, he's been an employee with a very generous compensation package. Natasha's voice hardened. One that just got terminated. The truth was more complicated. Natasha had seen this coming long before she found the second phone. David's drinking had increased, his interest in day-to-day operations had disappeared, and he'd started making comments about deserving better than their life together. She'd spent 18 months quietly restructuring everything, creating legal safeguards that looked like routine business reorganization. Her grandmother used to say, "A smart woman prepares for winter while it's still summer." Natasha had prepared for a blizzard. What about Veronica? Alyssa asked. What about her? David's been promising her the penthouse condo downtown. She's been posting photos of it on social media, calling it their new beginning. Natasha felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. That condo isn't David's to promise. It's owned by the Coleman Trust, has been for 6 months. Legal scheduled the notice to be served the moment he tried to move her in. While you were in labor? I multitask well. Natasha glanced at her phone as another message appeared. From an unknown number. Congratulations on the babies. Hope you're enjoying your last night in that hospital bed. Tomorrow's going to be very different. V. Veronica. The woman had the audacity to send threats while Natasha was still recovering from childbirth. Alyssa. Change of plans. Initiate the lockout protocol. The moment he tries to move money, I want him blocked. Natasha. He just made this personal in a way I can't ignore. Her voice carried a steel that made seasoned developers nervous. David wants to play games while I'm vulnerable? Fine. Let's see how he handles vulnerability. But as Natasha ended the call and stared at Veronica's message, she realized David's betrayal was about to reveal something much worse. She opened the second phone again and her stomach dropped. The emails weren't just about an affair. They were about sabotage. Every delayed permit, every mysteriously withdrawn investor, every unexpected zoning issue over the past 8 months. All David's work. He'd been actively destroying her projects to drive down Coleman Development's value before selling to Meridian Corp. He hadn't just planned to leave her. He'd planned to destroy everything she'd built first. Natasha looked at her twins. Then at David's papers on the bed. Proceed, she texted Alyssa. And preserve everything. Because tomorrow wasn't about divorce anymore. It was about a takeover. 6 hours later, David Coleman stood in the marble lobby of the Meridian Hotel, watching Veronica pace in a figure-hugging red dress that cost more than most people's rent. She was beautiful in the way that made men forget their responsibilities, which was exactly why he'd forgotten his. You're late, Veronica snapped, not bothering with a greeting kiss. I've been waiting 40 minutes. Sorry, the lawyer took longer than expected. David pulled out his phone to show her a photo of the signed divorce papers. But it's done. Natasha signed everything. Veronica's expression softened slightly. How did she take it? Better than I thought. She was practically catatonic from the delivery. Didn't even fight. David felt a surge of satisfaction. For once, Natasha hadn't been the one in control. My attorney says with the papers filed we can fast-track everything. 60 days and I'm free. 10 miles away, Alyssa was already at her desk, screens lit, coffee untouched. Her phone rang. Private number. This is Alyssa. Miss Grant? This is Rebecca Ibarra from First National. I have an unusual request that I wanted to verify directly with management. Alyssa's pulse quickened. First National held the primary operating accounts for Coleman Development. What kind of request? David Coleman called about an hour ago, requesting a wire transfer for $800,000 to a private account. When I asked for verification, he became aggressive. Said he was the company president and didn't need his wife's permission to move money. Alyssa almost smiled. David was already trying to grab cash, just as Natasha had predicted. Ms. Ibarra, I need to inform you that as of tonight, David Coleman no longer has authorization to access any Coleman Development accounts. This should have been updated in your system. It was. That's why I'm calling. When I told him his access had been revoked, he threatened to sue the bank. Said there had to be a mistake. Rebecca's voice lowered. He also asked for account balances on several trusts and subsidiary companies. I couldn't provide that information, but his reaction was concerning. What kind of reaction? He went very quiet, then asked if I was certain about the access revocation. When I confirmed, he hung up without another word. David's fingers drummed against the bar table as his thoughts raced. Alyssa felt a chill. Rebecca, I need you to flag any account that David Coleman has ever had access to. If he tries to contact the bank again, refer him to our legal department. Already done. But Ms. Grant? You should know he also asked about the Pinnacle deal. Specifically, he wanted to know if the funds had been deposited and where they were allocated. The Pinnacle funds. $2 billion that David thought he owned half of, sitting in accounts he could no longer touch. Back at the Meridian, David's phone was ringing. First National Bank. He answered immediately. Mr. Coleman, I can't proceed, the banker said. You no longer have authorization. The hotel bar seemed to tilt around David. That's impossible. I'm the company president. I'm sorry, sir, but that's what our system shows. The change was updated today. David ended the call with shaking hands. Veronica was watching him from across their table, her expression shifting from annoyed to concerned. What's wrong? Nothing. Just a bank error. But David's mind was racing. Natasha had signed those papers 6 hours ago. She was still in the hospital, probably sedated, barely conscious. How could she have revoked his access? Unless she'd planned this. The thought hit him like ice water. The woman who'd built a development empire before her 30th birthday, who negotiated million-dollar deals like chess games, who never made a move without calculating 5 steps ahead. That woman wouldn't be caught off guard by divorce papers. David pulled out his second phone, the one with the encrypted messages between him and Meridian Corporation. His eyes darted toward the exits, then back to the screen. He scrolled through the messages, his breathing shallow. Delays. Accidents. Names. Dates. She had this phone, he was finished. David. Veronica's voice cut through his panic. You're scaring me. He looked up at the woman who'd convinced him to betray everything he'd built with Natasha. Beautiful, ambitious Veronica, who worked for Meridian Corp., who'd first approached him at an industry conference 8 months ago. Veronica, David said slowly, when did you first mention Meridian's interest in acquiring Coleman Development? She blinked, surprised by the question. I don't remember exactly. Why? Was it before or after we started dating? David, why does it matter? We're celebrating. Before or after? His voice turned sharp. Veronica set down her wine glass. Before. David, you're freaking me out. She targeted him deliberately. His grip tightened on both phones. David stared across the table at the woman he'd destroyed his marriage for, finally seeing her clearly. Beautiful, calculating Veronica, who'd played him like an instrument while Natasha had been building the life he was about to lose. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Notice to vacate. Noon tomorrow. Failure to comply will result in removal. Coleman Trust Legal Department. Veronica's phone buzzed. Her face drained of color. David. She whispered. My condo. And David finally understood. Natasha wasn't reacting. She was executing. David Coleman's hands shook as he tried his keycard at the Coleman Development building at 6:47 a.m. The red light blinked mockingly. He tried again. Still red. Sir. The security guard approached, someone David didn't recognize. Can I help you? I'm David Coleman. president of the company. David's voice carried authority he no longer possessed. The guard checked his tablet. I'm sorry, Mr. Coleman, but you're not on the authorized access list for today. That's impossible. I built this company. Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the entrance. David felt the stares of arriving employees, people who used to report to him, now watching his humiliation through the glass doors. Behind the guard, he could see Alyssa Grant at the reception desk, calmly handling morning calls as if nothing had changed. As if his entire life hadn't collapsed overnight. Across town, Natasha watched the updates from her hospital bed and didn't blink. Her phone buzzed. Alyssa. He's here. Alyssa's voice was calm. Tried to badge in. Security handled it exactly as you instructed. How did he look? Confused. Angry. Starting to panic. Good. Phase 2. Legal served the restraining order on Veronica 20 minutes ago. She's been calling the office every 5 minutes demanding to speak with David. Our receptionist has been very politely informing her that Mr. Coleman no longer works here. Natasha shifted carefully, mindful of her stitches. And the Meridian meeting? Scheduled for 10 a.m. They still think David can deliver the company sale. They have no idea he never actually owned what he was promising to sell. 3 miles away, Veronica Stokes stood in the marble lobby of what used to be her luxury condo, surrounded by boxes and the remnants of a life built on lies. The eviction had been swift and legally airtight. Apparently she'd never actually been a tenant. David had simply been giving her access to a property owned by his wife's trust. Her phone rang. Meridian Corp. Veronica? It's James Walsh. We need to talk. James was her boss at Meridian, the one who'd been pushing her to get David to bring the deal in. The plan had seemed simple 8 months ago. Get close to David, convince him to sell and split the commission. James, this isn't a good time. Make it a good time. David was supposed to deliver signed preliminary agreements by 9 a.m. It's past 10 and he's not answering his phone. Veronica looked around at her boxes, at the life she was about to lose. There might be a problem. What kind of problem? The divorce kind. Silence. Then, Veronica, please tell me you didn't let him file for divorce before securing the company sale. He said it would be fine. He said he owned half of everything. He owns half of what exists in community property. If his wife transferred assets before the divorce filing, if she restructured the company. James's voice turned dangerous. Veronica, how much does she know? Veronica's stomach dropped. About what? About you. About us. About the real reason you're in David Coleman's bed. Across town, David sat in his BMW in the Coleman Development parking lot, watching employees filter into the building he could no longer enter. His phone had been ringing non-stop. Meridian Corp., his lawyer, his accountant, creditors he didn't even know existed. But it was the text message from his divorce attorney that made his blood run cold. Emergency meeting required. Your wife's legal team filed responses that raise serious questions about your authority to negotiate the asset division you're claiming. We need to discuss potential fraud charges. Fraud charges. The words hit him like a physical blow. He tried to log in. Everything was locked. His phone buzzed with a text from Veronica. We need to meet. No. Everything is falling apart. But before David could respond, another message appeared. From Natasha's number. I know you're trying to understand what's happening. Meet me at the hospital. Room 412. Come alone. We need to talk. David read it twice. Meet me. Room 412. Come alone. His throat tightened. Because if Natasha still wanted to talk after everything, it wasn't to beg. It was to finish. Room 412 was smaller than David remembered, but then again everything felt smaller now. Natasha sat propped against pillows, looking pale but alert, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The twins slept in a clear bassinet beside her bed, tiny and perfect and completely unaware that their father had just lost everything. You came, Natasha said without looking up from her tablet. You asked me to. David stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to sit. Natasha, I know you're angry. Angry. She finally looked at him and her expression was so calm it was terrifying. David, I was angry 6 months ago when I found your second phone. David's stomach dropped. You knew. I've known since March. Natasha gestured to the chair beside her bed. Sit down. David remained standing. If you knew, why didn't you confront me? Because confrontation would have given you time to prepare. Natasha reached for a manila folder on her bedside table. I needed to understand the full scope first. She slid one page across the bed. An email thread. His name all over it, conversations with Meridian Corp about permit delays, project sabotage, coordinated value reduction. David's mouth went dry. How did you? Shared cloud, Natasha said. You were careless. David sank into the chair, scanning the emails he'd thought were private. But Veronica was reporting back to Meridian. Natasha's voice carried no emotion. You were a doorway. She used it. The words hit David like physical blows. He looked at the twins, at these children he'd barely thought about while planning his escape. Their names are Sophia and Marcus, Natasha said, following his gaze. David felt something break inside his chest. Natasha, I can explain. There's nothing to explain. She tapped her tablet. While you were celebrating last night, the Pinnacle close finalized the trust structure. His phone buzzed. First National. Accounts frozen pending fraud review. David stared at the screen like it was a foreign language. It's starting, Natasha said. Starting. Cascade. You tried to access frozen accounts yesterday. That triggered fraud protocols. Her voice stayed calm. Right now, 3 banks are discovering irregularities in your signature authority. Another buzz. Credit services. Card suspended pending verification. David's chest tightened. I'm the president of Coleman Development. You were, Natasha corrected. You had shares. You never had control. And as of yesterday, you don't have signature authority. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the city sprawled below them. A city where his name had once meant something. The Meridian deal is over. Natasha's voice was final. They needed Coleman Development intact for acquisition. What you gave them was a company structured as fraud bait. David turned back to her. There has to be something. Some way to fix this. Natasha looked down at Sophia in her arms. You made choices, David. Deliberate choices over more than a year. Choices have consequences. David moved toward the bed, toward his wife and children. I can change. You can't change this. David's second phone lit up with a new email. Meridian Legal. Cease all contact immediately. Do not contact Meridian personnel. David stared at the message, his hands shaking. They're cutting me off. Natasha looked at him once. No anger, just certainty. They used you. And now they're cutting you loose. David felt the room spinning around him. The woman he'd thought he could manipulate, the wife he'd tried to destroy while she was vulnerable, had been 10 steps ahead of him for months. How long have I been walking into this? He whispered. Natasha adjusted Sophia in her arms. Since the day you decided I was the enemy instead of your partner. David looked at his family, his wife, his children, his life, and realized he was looking at everything he was about to lose. And for the first time since entering the hospital room, he understood that the woman holding his daughter wasn't the victim of his betrayal. She was the architect of his destruction. David Coleman sat in his BMW in the hospital parking garage, staring at his phone as his life disintegrated in real time. The Meridian email was still open. Cease all contact immediately. He tried calling Veronica. Straight to voicemail. He tried calling James Walsh at Meridian. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Veronica's number changed. Meridian had already made her disappear from his life. He tried calling his divorce attorney. Mr. Coleman, I'm going to need you to settle your outstanding balance before we can continue representation. Outstanding balance. David checked his banking app with trembling fingers. Account frozen. He tried another account. Frozen. His business credit line. Suspended. His phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Coleman? This is Detective Rourke with the Financial Crimes Unit. We need to schedule an interview regarding irregularities in Coleman Development's financial records. David's throat went dry. I don't understand. Sir, we have evidence suggesting unauthorized transfers and fraudulent signature authorities dating back several months. There's a bar complaint attached to this. Get counsel. David ended the call, his hands shaking violently. A bar complaint that could suspend his law license. which meant he couldn't even represent himself. He started the car and drove toward home, but when he pulled into his driveway, something was wrong. The locks had been changed. The house was no longer his to enter. 2 days later, a tow truck lifted his car like it weighed nothing. The driver handed him a clipboard. Payment bounced. Bank froze the account. We're reclaiming the vehicle. David stood on the sidewalk watching his BMW disappear, holding nothing but his phone and wallet. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Local development executive under investigation for corporate fraud. David clicked the link with numb fingers. The article was comprehensive, detailed, and devastating. Anonymous sources had provided documentation of his sabotage campaign, his unauthorized activities, his role in the attempted corporate takeover. But worse was the single quote that destroyed everything. He was always riding her coattails. David felt something die inside his chest. His reputation, the thing he'd valued more than his marriage, was gone. His phone rang. His mother. David? I just saw the news. What's happening? David couldn't find words. How do you explain to the woman who raised you that you've destroyed everything good in your life? David, talk to me. Mom, I made some mistakes. Mistakes? The article says you stole from your own company. It says you were trying to sell it without Natasha's knowledge. David closed his eyes. It's complicated. Is it true about the affair? Silence. David Anthony Coleman, is it true? Yes. His mother's voice broke. While she was pregnant. While she was carrying your babies. I wasn't thinking clearly. You weren't thinking at all. His mother's disappointment cut deeper than any legal threat. That girl built you a life. She gave you everything and you threw it away for what? For what? David looked around at the empty street, at his phone full of disconnected numbers and frozen accounts. For nothing. That evening, David sat in a roadside motel room that he'd paid for with the last cash in his wallet. His credit cards were all frozen. His clothes were still in a house he couldn't access. His phone buzzed. One final message from a number he didn't recognize. David, this is a representative from Natasha's legal team. The twins came home from the hospital today. They're healthy and safe. Your custody hearing is next month. If you want to be in their lives, start getting help now. David stared at the screen. Because for the first time, the consequences weren't money. They were his children. David Coleman had been awake for 37 straight hours when he finally found a lawyer willing to take his case. The office was in a strip mall between a payday loan shop and a bail bondsman, not exactly the white shoe firm where he used to practice. Mr. Coleman? The lawyer, Brad Hutchins, looked like he'd seen better decades. I reviewed the materials you sent. I have to be honest, this is bad. David slumped in the plastic chair. How bad? Criminal fraud charges are almost certain. The state bar complaint is proceeding. Your wife's legal team has documented everything. Brad flipped through a folder. But the custody case is what worries me most. What do you mean? Mr. Coleman, you're about to be a defendant in multiple felony cases. You have no income, no assets, no stable housing. Brad's voice was gentle but firm. If you're indicted and unstable, you won't get unsupervised time. Not now. David's chest tightened. They're my children. Are they? Because according to these documents, you served divorce papers to their mother while she was recovering from childbirth. Brad set down the folder. The question isn't whether you have parental rights. The question is whether exercising those rights would harm the children. The words hit David like a physical blow. So what are my options? There's a plea deal on the table. Brad pulled out another document. Plead and cooperate. Reduce time, restitution, and a recommendation that keeps you out of prison. Refuse, they'll try it and you could lose years. David stared at the cooperation agreement. Cooperate means testifying against Meridian Corp? Against everyone involved. Veronica Stokes, James Walsh, the whole conspiracy. Brad's voice lowered. Mr. Coleman, pride is a luxury you can't afford anymore. David's phone buzzed. A message from Natasha's attorney. Update. The twins are home. They're healthy. David's vision blurred. Sophia and Marcus, barely a week old, learning to live without him. His phone buzzed again. This time from an unknown number. Meridian is blaming you. I have proof. Decide by morning. V. Veronica. Even now she was trying to pull him into another scheme. There's something else you need to understand, Brad continued. If you take this deal, it becomes public record. Every detail of the affair, the sabotage, the conspiracy, it all comes out in open court. David understood immediately. Taking the plea meant Sophia and Marcus would grow up knowing their father had been seduced into betraying their mother. It meant any chance of reconciliation with Natasha would die forever. But refusing the plea meant gambling on a trial he couldn't win, risking years in prison while his children forgot he existed. How long do I have to decide? The prosecutor wants an answer by morning. David stared at the cooperation agreement on the desk. The document that would save him from prison and destroy what was left of his reputation forever. His phone buzzed one more time. Another message from Natasha's attorney with a photo attached. 2 tiny faces, peaceful in their cribs, home at last. David looked at his children's faces, then at the pen in his hand. If he signed, he'd admit what he'd done, and help bring down Meridian. If he didn't, he'd gamble on trial and risk prison. He looked at the photo Natasha's attorney had sent. 2 tiny faces, home at last. David picked up the pen. And for the first time in months he chose something that wasn't about his ego. The federal courthouse was buzzing with activity when David arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, flanked by Brad Hutchins and 2 federal prosecutors. News vans lined the street. Word had leaked about the Coleman development case expanding into a full-scale investigation of corporate fraud. Mr. Coleman, the prosecutor adjusted her files. Before we begin your testimony, I want you to understand what we've uncovered using your evidence. David nodded, his throat dry. Meridian Corp has used similar tactics across multiple states: seduction, sabotage, forced sales at below market value. Her voice was grim. Your wife's documentation helped us connect patterns we'd been investigating. David felt a chill. Natasha helped you? Mrs. Coleman contacted our office 6 weeks ago. She provided evidence of Meridian's systematic market manipulation, including recorded conversations. The prosecutor paused. Mr. Coleman, your wife wasn't just protecting her assets. She was building a case. The deposition room was stark and windowless. David sat across from defense attorneys representing Meridian Corp., Veronica and James Walsh. The court reporter's fingers moved silently across her machine as David began to speak. State your name for the record. David Michael Coleman. For 2 hours David laid out the timeline. Every meeting with Veronica, every suggestion she'd made about Coleman Development's operations, every delay that had followed their conversations. Then the prosecutors showed him the recording that changed everything. Mr. Coleman, do you recognize this conversation? David put on the headphones. Veronica's voice filled his ears. Natasha's getting suspicious about the permit delays. What if she figures out we're coordinating this? She won't. James Walsh's voice was calm, calculating. Women like her think they're the smartest person in the room. She'll never imagine her husband is working against her. And if she does? Then we accelerate. Force her hand. Make her desperate enough to sell at whatever price we offer. David pulled off the headphones, his hands shaking. Mr. Coleman, Meridian documented everything internally. Compliance logs, legal memos, message archives. Once the subpoenas hit, those records stopped being private. David stared at the defense table. James Walsh was whispering urgently to his attorney, but Veronica was looking directly at David for the first time all day. Her expression wasn't angry. It was grateful. Because David's testimony wasn't just exposing his own crimes. It was proving that both he and Veronica had been manipulated by a corporation that had planned to sacrifice them from the beginning. Based on your testimony today, we'll be filing conspiracy and fraud charges against Meridian Corp executives. Your cooperation agreement includes testifying in those trials as well. David nodded. I understand. As he left the courthouse, David's phone buzzed. From Natasha, thank you for telling the truth. He stared at it, unsure what hurt more, her gratitude or how much he didn't deserve it. Then another message came from her attorney. Custody conference scheduled. Bring counsel. Cooperation will be considered. David exhaled. For the first time since the twins were born, he understood the shape of his future. Not as a winner. As someone rebuilding from the bottom. 18 months later, David Coleman sat in family court wearing a suit from Target, watching his soon-to-be ex-wife testify about his fitness as a father. Natasha looked composed and professional at the witness stand, her voice steady as she answered the judge's questions. Mrs. Coleman, what is your position regarding Mr. Coleman's request for supervised visitation? Your Honor, David has completed court-ordered counseling, maintained steady employment and cooperated with investigators. He's fulfilled restitution ahead of schedule. Natasha's voice was measured. I believe supervised visits are appropriate. The judge reviewed the case file. Mr. Coleman, please stand. David stood, his hands clasped behind his back. The man who'd once negotiated million-dollar deals now worked as a compliance consultant for $45,000 a year, helping companies avoid the mistakes he'd made. It was honest work, and it was slowly rebuilding his reputation in an industry that no longer trusted him with major decisions. Mr. Coleman, you've complied with all court requirements. Supervised visitation is granted. 2 hours every Saturday with review in 6 months. 2 hours. David felt his chest tighten, then forced himself to remember where he'd started. 18 months ago he'd had no legal right to see his children at all. Natasha walked out with full custody and full control of Coleman Development, exactly as the trust was designed to ensure. After the hearing, David and Natasha walked silently to the parking garage. She looked tired but strong, the kind of strength that came from surviving something terrible and rebuilding carefully. How are they? David asked quietly. Sophia is walking. Elias says Mama, and no. Natasha's voice softened slightly. They're good kids, David. Happy kids. David nodded, not trusting his voice. His children were growing up without him, reaching milestones he'd never see except in supervised visits and photographs. David. Natasha turned back. Your first visit is this Saturday. Don't be late. I won't. And they don't know about everything. They just know Daddy lives somewhere else now. Let's keep it that way until they're old enough to understand. David felt tears building behind his eyes. Thank you. Natasha didn't smile, but her expression softened. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for doing the work to earn it. Saturday morning, David sat in a supervised visitation room at the Family Services building, watching his 18-month-old children play with blocks. Sophia had Natasha's dark eyes and his stubborn chin. Elias had David's nose and a smile that lit up the room. Daddy. Sophia looked up at him, uncertain but curious. David's heart broke and healed simultaneously. Yes, sweetheart. I'm Daddy. She held up a red block, offering it to him. David took it carefully as if it were made of glass. Thank you, Sophia. It's beautiful. Elias crawled over and pulled himself up using David's leg, babbling in the language only toddlers understood. David lifted him carefully, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and innocence. For 2 hours, David built block towers and read picture books and played peekaboo, storing every moment in his memory like treasure. When the social worker announced that time was up, David felt the familiar ache of having to say goodbye. I love you both, he whispered as he hugged them. Daddy will see you next Saturday. Sophia nodded solemnly and handed him another block. Daddy keep. David walked to his car holding a red plastic block. 2 hours wasn't a reunion. It was a start. He placed the block on his desk at home, proof he'd shown up. And for the first time in a long time he understood what earning meant. 6 months later a message popped up, visitation review scheduled. David stared at it, then at the growing collection of red blocks on his desk. Next Saturday couldn't come soon enough. What did this story teach you about the true cost of betrayal and the real meaning of strength? Sometimes we lose everything we thought we wanted only to discover what we actually needed. Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.